In a small village in the eastern part of Nigeria, there lived a young man named Kofi. He was known for his strength, wisdom, and good looks. Kofi was the pride of his family and the envy of many in the village. But like many young men, he was curious and sometimes reckless. Kofi was different from the other young men in the village, tall and handsome with a quick smile and clever eyes. But Kofi had a problem. He was too curious. Sometimes this made him do silly things. When Kofi was growing up, he always wanted to know about everything. He would ask many questions. He was known for his bravery and curiosity. Kofi was the pride of his family and the envy of many in the village. But like many young men, he was curious and sometimes reckless. Kofi heard the stories about the old ancient hut. While others stayed away, he wanted to know more. He would look at the hut and wonder what was inside. The more people told him to stay away, the more he wanted to go there. Since childhood, Kofi had always wondered about the old hut at the edge of the village. It stood apart from the other houses, looking abandoned and mysterious. Whenever he asked his parents about it, they would give him the same warning. "Kofi, my son," his father would say sternly, "that hut is not abandoned. There are people living inside. Stay away from it." The old hut stood at the edge of a small village in Nigeria, a silent guardian of secrets untold. For years, silent and forbidding, it had been the subject of hushed whispers and curious glances. But no one dared to approach it. No one except Kofi. But Kofi couldn't understand. He had never seen anyone enter or leave the hut. "But Baba," he would argue, "how can people live there? I've never seen anyone." His mother would join in, her voice soft but firm. "Kofi, some things in this world are not for us to understand. Just obey your father and stay away from that place." As Kofi grew older, his curiosity only increased. On a hot afternoon, when the village was quiet and sleepy, Kofi decided it was time to uncover the truth. He wiped the sweat from his brow and took a deep breath. "Today's the day," he muttered to himself. "I'm going to find out what's really in that hut." As Kofi walked towards the old hut, memories from his childhood came rushing back to him. It was like watching an old movie in his head. He remembered being a small boy, maybe 7 or 8 years old, always curious about the mysterious building at the edge of the village. He remembered asking his father about the hut when he was just a boy. "Father," young Kofi had said, his voice small but curious, "why does nobody ever go into that old hut at the edge of the village?" His father had stopped eating and put down his bowl of fufu. His face became very serious, like it did when he was about to say something important. He looked straight into Kofi's eyes. "Listen carefully, my son," his father had said in a low, serious voice. "That hut is not empty like you might think. There are things living there, things that we don't understand. They are powerful and dangerous. Promise me that you will stay away from that place. Do you understand?" Young Kofi had nodded, his eyes wide with fear and curiosity. "Yes, father," he had said. "I promise." But promises made when you're a child don't always last. They often fade with time. As Kofi grew older, he started to wonder if his father had just been trying to scare him. Maybe there wasn't really anything dangerous in the hut. Maybe it was just an old story to keep children from wandering too far from the village. Now, standing before the weathered door of the old hut, he was a man now, tall and strong, but he still felt like that curious little boy. His heart was beating fast, partly from excitement and partly from fear. Kofi felt a mixture of excitement and fear. He took a deep breath and pushed the door open. It made a loud creaking noise, like it was angry at being disturbed after so many years. Kofi winced at the sound, worried that someone might hear and come to stop him. As he stepped inside, Kofi was hit by a wave of musty air. It smelled old and damp, like wet leaves and rotting wood. The hut was very dark inside. Only a little bit of light came through the cracks in the walls and the holes in the roof. Kofi stood still for a moment, letting his eyes get used to the darkness. He could see dust floating in the air where the light came in, like tiny dancers moving in the beams of sunlight. As Kofi's eyes adjusted to the dim light, he started to make out shapes in the hut. There were old pieces of furniture covered in cobwebs, broken pots on the floor, and strange markings on the walls that he couldn't understand. But then Kofi saw something that made his heart jump in his chest. In the center of the room, standing perfectly still, was a figure. At first, Kofi thought it might be a person, and he almost ran out of the hut in fear. It was unlike anything Kofi had ever seen before. Carved from dark stone, it depicted a woman with strange symbols etched all over her body. Her eyes seemed to follow Kofi as he moved around the room. "What are you?" Kofi whispered, reaching out to touch the statue. The moment his fingers made contact with the cool stone, a searing pain shot through his body. Kofi cried out, stumbling backward. The pain centered in his groin, growing more intense with each passing second. "What's happening to me?" Kofi shouted, his voice bouncing off the walls of the empty hut. The sound of his own scared voice made him even more frightened. Kofi felt a strange tingling sensation in his lower body. It started as a small itch, but quickly grew into a burning feeling that he couldn't ignore. His heart began to race, and sweat broke out on his forehead. With shaking hands, Kofi grabbed the edge of his wrapper, the cloth he wore around his waist. He was scared to look, but he knew he had to. In one quick motion, he yanked the wrapper down. What Kofi saw made him scream so loud that birds flew from the nearby trees. His manhood, the part that made him a man, was getting smaller right before his eyes. It was shrinking, as if someone was squeezing it like a sponge. Kofi watched in horror as it got smaller and smaller, until finally, it disappeared completely. Kofi's legs felt weak. He fell to his knees on the dusty floor of the hut, unable to believe what he was seeing. Where his manhood had been, there was now only smooth skin, like the skin on his arm or leg. This can't be real, Kofi thought. He reached down with a trembling hand and touched the area. He hoped that he would feel something, that maybe his eyes were playing tricks on him. But as his fingers touched the smooth skin, he knew it was true. His manhood was gone. "No, no, no," Kofi cried out. Tears began to roll down his face, dripping onto the dirt floor of the hut. "This can't be happening. It's not possible." Kofi looked up at the statue that stood in the middle of the hut. In the dim light, it seemed to be laughing at him, even though its face didn't move. The strange symbols carved all over its body seemed to shine and move, as if they were alive. Kofi didn't understand what they meant, but he knew they were part of some ancient magic that was far more powerful than anything he had ever known. Desperate and scared, Kofi crawled on his hands and knees towards the statue. His wrapper dragged in the dust behind him, but he didn't care. When he reached the statue, he looked up at its face, his eyes full of tears. "Please," Kofi begged, his voice shaking. "Please give it back to me. I'm so sorry I touched you. I didn't know what would happen. I was just curious. Please, I'm begging you, undo this curse." But the statue didn't answer. It stood there, cold and silent, not moving or changing at all. Kofi kept crying and pleading, hoping that somehow the statue would hear him and take pity on him. But nothing happened. Kofi sat there on the floor of the hut for a long time. He lost track of how long he had been there, crying and begging. The light coming through the cracks in the walls began to change color, turning orange and then red. Kofi realized that the sun was setting. A new fear gripped him. He couldn't stay in this hut all night. His family would wonder where he was. And what if the statue did something even worse to him in the dark? With a heavy heart, Kofi knew he had to leave. He slowly got to his feet, his legs shaky and weak. He took one last look at the statue, hoping for a miracle, but it remained as still and silent as ever. Kofi adjusted his wrapper, making sure it was secure around his waist. He wiped the tears from his face with the back of his hand and took a deep breath. Then, feeling more scared and alone than he ever had in his life, Kofi stepped out of the hut and into the fading light of day. As he walked home, Kofi's mind raced with thoughts and questions. How would he explain this to his parents? What would happen to his future? What would he tell Oluchi, the girl he was supposed to marry? How could he live in the village like this? And most of all, was there any way to undo what the statue had done to him? As he approached his family's compound, he saw his parents sitting outside. His mother was the first to notice him. "Kofi!" she called out. "You're late for dinner. Where have you been?" Kofi couldn't meet their eyes. He stood there, shifting from foot to foot, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mother, Father, something terrible has happened." His father frowned, setting down the corn he was eating. "What is it, my son? You look like you've seen a ghost." Kofi took a deep breath, tears already forming in his eyes. I went to the old hut. There was a statue inside, and when I touched it..." His voice broke, and he had to force out the words. "It cursed me. My manhood is gone." There was a moment of stunned silence. Then his father exploded in anger. "Foolish boy!" Kofi's father roared, jumping to his feet so quickly that his chair fell backwards with a loud clatter. His face turned red with anger, and the veins in his neck bulged as he shouted, "We warned you many times. We told you over and over to stay away from that cursed hut. Don't you understand? Ancient powers are not something to play with." Kofi's mother let out a gasp of shock. Her hands flew to her mouth, covering it as her eyes grew wide with fear and disbelief. "Oh, Kofi," she whispered, her voice trembling. Tears began to form in her eyes. "What have you done, my son? What terrible thing have you brought upon yourself?" Kofi couldn't bear to see the disappointment and fear in his parents' eyes. His legs felt weak, and he fell to his knees on the hard-packed dirt floor. Tears streamed down his face as he began to sob uncontrollably. His whole body shook with each breath he took. "I'm sorry," Kofi cried out, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I didn't know this would happen. I didn't think it was real. I thought it was just an old story to scare children." He looked up at his parents, his eyes pleading. "Please help me. There must be something we can do to fix this." His father paced back and forth, his footsteps heavy with anger and worry. He ran his hand over his face, trying to calm himself down. "Help you," he said, his voice a mix of frustration and despair. "How can we help you, Kofi? This is beyond our power. We are simple farmers, not magicians or witch doctors." Kofi's mother knelt down beside him, torn between comforting her son and being angry at his disobedience. She reached out a shaking hand and gently touched Kofi's shoulder. "My son," she said softly, "we told you to stay away for a reason. That hut has been forbidden for generations. The elders say it holds powers from the old times, powers that we no longer understand. Kofi looked up at his mother, his face wet with tears. But why didn't you tell me what would happen? Why didn't you explain? His father stopped pacing and turned to face Kofi. Because we didn't know exactly what would happen, he said, his voice calmer now, but still filled with disappointment. We only knew it would be bad. The stories passed down from our ancestors were not clear. They only warned of great misfortune for those who dared to enter the hut. Kofi fell to his knees, sobbing. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I didn't know this would happen. Please help me. But his father turned away, his face hard and cold. You brought this on yourself, Kofi, he said, his voice full of disappointment. We warned you many times. How can we help you now? What will everyone in the village say when they find out? Kofi's mother stood nearby, her eyes filled with tears. She looked torn between being angry at her son and wanting to comfort him. After a moment, she shook her head and said, Go to your room, Kofi. I can't even look at you right now. Go and think about what you've done. Feeling heartbroken and ashamed, Kofi walked slowly to his small room. He lay down on his thin sleeping mat and stared up at the straw roof of the hut. His mind was racing with worries and fears. He knew he had to tell Oluchi about what happened. Oluchi was the pretty girl from the next village that his parents had chosen for him to marry. They had been friends since childhood, and he had grown to love her. The thought of telling her about losing his manhood made his stomach hurt and his hands shake. He imagined Oluchi's face, her big brown eyes, her kind smile. How would she look at him now? Would she still want to marry him? Could they have a family together? But just thinking about it made his stomach hurt with fear. Kofi barely slept that night. When the sun came up the next morning, he got up and went to find Oluchi. He knew she would be at the village well, where all the women went to get water each day. He saw her there, carrying her clay water jug on her head. When Oluchi spotted Kofi, she smiled brightly. But as he got closer, her smile quickly disappeared. She could see something was very wrong. Kofi, what's the matter? Oluchi asked, carefully setting down her heavy water jug. You look awful. Are you sick? Kofi took a deep breath and gently held Oluchi's hands in his. His voice was shaky as he spoke. Oluchi's eyes grew wide with shock. She pulled her hands away and took a step back. What? What do you mean? You've lost your manhood. How can that happen? Are you joking? Kofi shook his head sadly. No, I'm not joking. I wish I was. Yesterday I went to the old hut at the edge of the village. You know, the one everyone says is cursed? Well, there was a strange statue inside. When I touched it, something magical happened. My manhood disappeared. It's just gone. Oluchi's face changed from shock to disbelief, then to fear. But that's impossible, Kofi. How can we get married if you can't? Oh, Kofi, what have you done? Tears began to form in Oluchi's eyes. She looked around nervously, worried that someone might overhear their conversation. The other women at the well were starting to stare at them curiously. I'm so sorry, Oluchi, Kofi said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean for this to happen. I was just curious about the old hut. I didn't know it would change everything. Oluchi wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. As he spoke, he watched the love in Oluchi's eyes turn to horror, then pity, and finally, a deep sadness. She looked at Kofi with a mixture of pity and sadness. I don't know what to say, Kofi. This is too much. I mean, how can we have a future together like this? I'm sorry, but you should go now. I need time to think. Please, just go away for now. I can't deal with this right now." Kofi felt as if his heart was being ripped from his chest. He had lost everything, his manhood, his parents' respect, and now the love of his life. He left the well in a daze, not knowing where to go or what to do. Feeling even more heartbroken than before, Kofi turned and walked away from the well. He could feel the eyes of the village women on his back, and he knew that soon everyone would be talking about him. His life, as he knew it, was over, and he had no idea how to fix it. In the days that followed, news of Kofi's misfortune spread quickly through the village. It was like a strong wind carrying dry leaves, unstoppable and reaching every corner. Wherever Kofi went, he felt eyes on him and heard people talking about him in low voices. One afternoon, as Kofi walked to fetch water, he passed a group of young boys playing with a ball made of tightly wound rags. One of them, a boy named Adebayo, pointed at Kofi and said loudly, "Look, it's the man who's not a man anymore." The other boys laughed, and Kofi felt his face grow hot with shame. At the village market, where women sold yams, cassava, and colourful cloth, Kofi overheard Mama Iabo, one of the oldest women in the village, gossiping with her friends. "I heard that boy Kofi turned into a woman," she said, her wrinkled face serious. "The gods must be very angry with him." These cruel words and stares hurt Kofi deeply. He began to stay inside his family's compound, afraid to face the villagers. He stopped helping his father on their small farm and avoided going to the market to trade. He avoided the village square where young men gathered to talk and laugh, now felt like a place he could never visit again. Kofi's life had become like a bad dream he couldn't wake up from. He felt trapped and alone, unsure of what to do or how to fix what had happened to him. But even in this dark time, a tiny bit of hope remained in Kofi's heart. It was small, like the flame of a dying candle, but it refused to go out completely. Kofi knew he had to find a way to break the curse and become a man again. So he spent long hours sitting alone, thinking hard. He tried to remember all the stories he had heard as a child about curses and magic. He thought about the tales the village elders told around the fire at night, wondering if any of them might hold the key to solving his problem. One night, Kofi lay on his sleeping mat, unable to close his eyes. The thatched roof of his family's hut loomed above him, its dried grass and reeds creating a maze of shadows in the dim moonlight. Through the gaps in the thatch, he could see slivers of the night sky, tiny points of starlight peeking through. His mind was like a river overflowing its banks, filled with worries and fears that wouldn't stop. As he stared at the thatched roof, counting the wooden beams for what felt like the 100th time, a sudden thought flashed through his mind. It was like a bolt of lightning in a dark sky, bright and unexpected. If the statue in the old hut had taken away his manhood, maybe it could give it back too. Kofi sat up quickly, his heart racing with excitement. But then, doubt crept in, like a cold wind through a crack in the wall. How could he make the statue return what it had taken? And if it was possible, what would he have to do? What price would he have to pay? These questions swirled in Kofi's mind, like leaves caught in a whirlwind. He knew that going back to the hut would be dangerous. The memory of what happened last time made his hands shake and his stomach feel tight with fear. But as he looked around his small, dark room, Kofi realized he had no other choice. He couldn't keep living like this, hiding from everyone, ashamed and afraid. As the night slowly turned to day, Kofi made up his mind. He would go back to the hut as soon as the sun rose. Whatever happened there couldn't be worse than the life he was living now. The first light of dawn was just beginning to paint the sky a pale blue when Kofi quietly got up from his mat. He put on his best wrapper, a piece of cloth his mother had given him for special occasions. He wanted to look his best, to show respect to whatever powers lived in the old hut. Kofi crept out of his family's compound, careful not to wake anyone. The packed earth was cool under his bare feet, still damp with morning dew. The village was quiet and peaceful. Kofi could hear the soft cooing of doves in the nearby trees and the distant crow of a rooster welcoming the new day. As he walked towards the edge of the village where the old hut stood, Kofi's heart began to beat faster. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if his feet were sinking into the ground. The hut looked different in the early morning light. Its mud walls cast long, dark shadows that seemed to reach out like fingers trying to grab him. Kofi stopped a few steps away from the hut's door. He could feel sweat on his forehead and under his arms, even though the morning air was still cool. For a moment, he thought about turning back. He could run home, crawl back onto his mat and pretend he had never left. But then, Kofi thought about his family, about Aluchi, about all the people in the village who now looked at him with pity or disgust. He couldn't keep living like that. He had to try to fix what had happened, no matter how scared he felt. "I have to do this," Kofi whispered to himself, trying to sound braver than he felt. His voice sounded small and shaky in the quiet morning air. "I have to make things right. I have to be a man again." Kofi took a deep breath and reached out his hand. It was trembling so much that he had trouble grasping the rough wooden handle of the door. The door creaked loudly as he pushed it open, the sound seeming to echo across the whole village. As Kofi stepped into the dark hut, he had no idea that this moment would change everything. He didn't know that what he was about to do would start a chain of events that would affect not just his own life, but the lives of everyone in his village. Inside the hut, it was even darker than Kofi remembered. The air felt thick and heavy, like breathing in dust. As his eyes slowly adjusted to the darkness, he could make out the shape of the statue in the center of the room. It stood there, silent and still, just as it had been before. But to Kofi, it seemed to loom larger, its presence filling the entire hut. Kofi's legs felt weak, and for a moment he thought he might fall. But he forced himself to stand straight and tall. He was here for a reason, and he wouldn't leave until he had tried everything he could think of to break the curse. As he took a step towards the statue, Kofi felt a strange, tingling sensation all over his body. It was as if the air in the hut was charged with some kind of energy he couldn't see or understand. He didn't know it yet, but his adventure was just beginning. The curse of the statue was far from over, and the path ahead of him would be filled with challenges he could never have imagined. Kofi took another step forward, his eyes fixed on the statue. Whatever happened next, there was no turning back now. Eager to find out what happens next in this story? Comment "Continue" below. Thanks for watching. We're excited to announce that we're back with more frequent content. You can now expect new videos 3 times a week on this channel. Don't forget to subscribe to stay updated with our latest releases. We truly appreciate your love and support so far. Let's continue this journey together.